was an interesting way to begin the book. And I'll try to summarize it succinctly, not read it directly. But you and a friend are having a picnic on a river, and suddenly you hear shouting, you see a child drowning. You dive in to save the child and bring him to safely to shore, and then immediately you hear another child. You dive in again, you save that child, and again you hear a child, and it continues and continues. And then your friend starts to run upstream. And you say, well, where are you going? I can't keep saving these kids. And he says, I'm going upstream to tackle the guy who keeps throwing these kids in the water. And so that I thought was a great parable to start the book, because that makes you start thinking of, okay, how do we solve problems before they begin? And if only upstream thinking and solving problems like that was that simple. And it's not. And that's what I like about this book, is that it talks about how it isn't simple. It's hard, and it's fraught with barriers and questions and conflicts and disasters that could happen. But conceptually, when we're we can solve problems before they begin by going upstream, it's a great concept, and I think we can all agree that we would rather solve an emergency before it becomes an emergency. But as I tell the city council and other groups, it's easy to agree to a grand conceptual idea. In concept, we can all agree to this. But when you start to discuss to take those dreams and make them reality, work on the details that are needed to make it reality, well, that's where the devil always is. And that's where the disagreements happen, and the resource constraints and other things. And that's what I really like about this book, is it talks about not just, hey, there's pie in the sky upstream, we can solve the world's problems, but it talks about the complexity of going upstream. And that's, so Dan Heath recognizes that going upstream is extremely complex. He uses the word upstream instead of proactive to be a little bit metaphoric. As he puts it, you can intervene in many different points in that stream in an almost limitless timeline, and you're always continuing to push upstream. So that's what I really found interesting about this book, and I'll try to summarize it a little bit. At the end of the day, he wants the readers of this book to shift more of our energies towards upstream, while at the same time open-eyed about the challenges that we'll face while doing so. And he recognizes that upstream includes a maze of unintended consequences, and that noble efforts to make the world a better place can very easily make the world worse. As one that I've known for always putting in a dose of reality during meetings when we're talking about the ideas, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about that? I found that interesting, at least because it kind of aligns with how I interact sometimes. So in the first chapter of the book, there he tells a story of an interview from a police chief that really resonated with me. So he tells us this story that, there's Officer A, who spends half the shift standing on a street corner where many accidents occur. Her visible presence makes the drivers more careful. No tickets are issued, no accidents occurred. All the officer did was remain visible at an intersection that had a history of accidents. Officer B hides around the corner, nabs everybody for taking that illegal left turn or running the red light. And it's Officer B that has a stack full of tickets, which ultimately is a data point to show effectiveness. But the question is who was really doing more for public safety? Was it Officer A, who has no tickets in her hand? Or is it Officer B, who has the stack full of tickets? And in a world where we live in, we live in a society that wants results. And a lot of the times we look at that Officer B and say, hey, that's where we're going to put our resources. They have results. There's a data point. It's easy. But it was really Officer A that did more for public safety that day. There's a family that didn't get into an accident because of Officer A's presence made them more cautious or made somebody else more cautious. And the family has no idea that it didn't happen, and neither does the officer. So how do you prove what didn't happen? Even if you feel confident that your effort accomplished something, you'll still never know who you helped. As the chief put it in the book, which I enjoyed, it's much easier to say I arrested this guy than to say I spent some time talking to a wayward kid. Now, the story resonated with me because it's the exact kind of philosophy that we've been trying to implement, at least in my tenure here at the city. You know, preventative maintenance with DPW to prevent higher costs and fixes and or replacements. Our code enforcement, that we do a rental housing inspection program, includes an education component for both landlords and tenants, so that we can ensure our housing stock doesn't go to a point of no return and that people have safe living conditions. Our fire department, we do fire education in our schools and a fire inspection program to catch things that would, could be disaster later. And even our police department, and it's not just the traffic detail in that example up above, but we have things like a behavioral intervention team, which is a coordination with the school district and counselors, and to find situations where kids are saying something on social media that concerning, and then try to intervene and prevent something like a violent thing from happening. I really enjoyed that that Dan Heath recognizes that we're people that we want have that are like to say, show me the statistics, show me the data, prove that the money is well spent, and that can oftentimes kill successful programs. That when there's real benefits that are hard to measure. That's the greatest thing I enjoyed about this is he's talking about the challenges to upstream thinking. It's not just a pie in the sky type of book. He does recognize in the next section of his book about 3 barriers to upstream thinking. I think there's really 4 after reading through it, but I will briefly review what he sees as the 3 barriers. He calls them problem blindness, lack of ownership, and tunneling. With problem blindness, Dan Heath says exactly, you can't solve a problem you can't see, or more likely, one that you perceive as regrettable but inevitable condition of life. We all fall victim to problem blindness. Example that I think of in my head is you start a do-it-yourself project in your house, putting new baseboard up in the room, and it's like, oh, I'll paint that later, and then later turns into a month, and then it becomes 2 months later, then it's a year later, and like you look down and you're like, oh shoot, I never painted that baseboard. So that seems to happen where we accept the abnormal as normal. And then we also become too focused at the task at hand. We fail to see the bigger picture in life. We fail to see the forest from the trees. Or we identify the wrong problem that needs to be addressed. Where something happens and we say, oh, we need to do this right now to solve that X, and it's completely the wrong direction to go. So one example that he uses in the book that I related to, because I hate the New England Patriots, is that he talks about the Patriots, and there was a sports trainer that in the late 90s recognized that the team was suffering a large number of hamstring injuries. And then he started to evaluate, well, how are we training these athletes? And he's looking at these football players, and they're all being trained to be bigger and stronger, which intuitively makes sense at the beginning, but then you're like, well, that's not necessarily why a wide receiver is injuring his hamstring. That person needs to cut and run fast. So he should be having a different individualized training as opposed to an offensive lineman, for example. As the trainer put it in the book, it's almost like walking into a doctor's office and without interviewing you, without conducting any tests, he gives you a prescription. So he changed the way the Patriots did their training of their football players, and the hamstring injuries changed from 22 to 3. Now, again, that was in the late 90s there, and as we all know, they went on a 20-year run of destruction of the Buffalo Bills and everything else. But, you know, so that's a bad example of upstream thinking. We want that to happen in Buffalo, not in New England. But anyways, the second barrier that Dan Heath recognizes towards upstream thinking is a lack of ownership. You know, that's not my problem to solve. And he uses an example of a law student sitting in a lecture hall, and she's got a guy with a big head sitting in front of her. And they play the tilting game where, you know, he tilts one way and she tilts the other, and then it keeps going back and forth, and it can be quite annoying. And then she realizes that, well, instead of getting annoyed and frustrated at the big-headed guy, she can get up and move her chair. So sometimes we have to stand up and look at it and find the obvious solution by changing our perspective and owning the problem. That's easier said than done. And he recognizes that we fail to own the problem sometimes because of self-interest, fragmented responsibilities, and a feeling of not my place. So self-interest, he uses an example of a tobacco company. They're in the best position to prevent the millions of deaths that tobacco cause, but that costs them a lot of money and their livelihoods. Or fragmented responsibilities, there's many different groups involved and not a single group owning the issue. And then feeling it's not my place. He talks about psychological standing. And, so if say there's and he uses this issue with gender, there's a women's issue, me as a guy would feel, oh, well, it's not my standing to stand up for that because it's not my gender. And he kind of talked about it as, and you think about it as legal standing. You have to be the one getting harmed to stand up for it, and that's not necessarily the case. And that can prevent us from owning a problem that exists. So he asked, in this section, this is, what harms are we willing to accept that we're capable of changing? And when we look at a problem through the eyes of that you're the only one responsible for it, whether that's true or not, we might find angles of influence that we can make a difference going upstream. The last barrier that he identifies is tunneling. I think we can all identify with this, is that we don't have the bandwidth to fix everything. And he talks about that researchers have found that when people experience scarcity, whether it be time or money, the harm is not the big problems crowd out the little ones. The harm is that the little ones crowd out the big ones. Means that we're all juggling problems, and that we're all trying to solve them, and we adopt a tunnel vision mentality to get through it. And sometimes that leads to long-term planning disappearing and no strategic prioritization. And that, so tunneling confines us in the short term and is a more reactive thinking. So he touches on it, what I think is the fourth barrier, but he doesn't identify it in the book. Because I think scarcity and tunneling are two different things. For me, another barrier, if I were to write this book, would be scarcity or resource constraints. If you don't have the resources to take on some of these big problems, or you're not going to get those resources, you don't even try sometimes. And that can be frustrating and difficult. So I say that should be a fourth barrier. And I think he combines tunneling with that a little bit. And, but that's just my opinion on it. So that's the three main barriers that he identifies in the book. And then he goes on to a section called 7 Questions of Upstream Leaders. And this section, the whole book is filled with a lot of examples and that make you think, oh, well, maybe I can do that, or how did they do that type of thing. And this section really has filled with just example upon example after example. I'm not sure I agree with all the examples and conclusions made in these sections, but they're still, thought-provoking, which is the whole point of the book, in my opinion. So the first question he talks about is how will you unite the right people? Essentially, is how do you get the right people in the room to solve the right problem? He doesn't necessarily answer how you do it. That's something we all have to figure out at times. But he does talk about going upstream is more of a voluntary effort. It's not the emergency you have to do. It's so people have to volunteer for it. So you need to have a big tent, and you need to maintain a big tent because you need to surround some of these problems. And in order to surround it, you need everybody that can address the issue in the room. So the aim has got to be compelling and important, and it's got to have a shared goal to keep them contributing, even in stressful situations. Because again, it's volunteer, and people can easily drop out. I think we've all seen that in our various walks of life, where we're trying to get a team to go in the right direction, and it just falls apart for various reasons. You got to all be going in the right direction. And then he does point out that you need to have data for the purpose of learning and not inspection. What does he mean by that? You're taking the data to learn how to get better going upstream. You're not using it to hold people accountable all the time, which I thought was a nice way of looking at it, because we always try to hold people accountable in our society and not try to learn from it and get better. But anyway, so then the next question he had was how you change the system. And he uses another metaphor in this one. He shares a story from David Forrest Wallace, which I'll summarize it, where there's two young fish swimming in a stream, and they pass an older fish swimming the other way, and the older fish says, "Hey, morning guys, how's the water?" And then eventually, one of the younger fish looks at the other one and says, "What the hell is water?" And Dan uses this to say, well, the system is the water, and the only way to change the system is to change the water. Now, to me, that's kind of overwhelming. How do you change the entire water system of a river? Me thinking complexly about it. It seems overwhelmingly daunting. But then he uses an example of fluoride in your drinking water, which is something we do here in the city. It doesn't have to be the whole system. It can be small incremental changes that make a big difference. So, using that fluoride example, first of all, it's naturally occurring in a lot of water sources, but we add a little bit more. And what does that do is that protects and strengthens your teeth from tooth decay. So much so that the CDC has named it one of the 10 greatest public health achievements in the 20th century. And thinking about that locally in our own backyards, there's kids down in Naples that don't have fluoride in their water. And you're talking to local dentists about it, they get 3 to 4 more cavities, the amount of cavities than kids in Canandaigua. So the difference is literally what's in the water. And the parents in Canandaigua probably have no clue that our fluoridation problem has saved them countless of dentist visits and thousands of dollars. But it's that kind of thinking that shows how complex our upstream thinking is and how difficult it can be to achieve and maintain. But at the same time, I know there's people that will question the fluoridation program and say it's worthless or causing other problems, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary and that it's beneficial. So at least that, for me, having that experience is what I found that interesting. He goes on with some other questions, and I'll keep going through those. Now, where can you find the point of leverage? So this is where do we intervene, essentially? What do we use to go upstream? When it comes to preventing the problems in complex systems, finding the right lever is precisely the hard part. as Dan puts it. So once you identify the leverage points, you can find the interventions that are plausible to accomplishing the goal. But at the same time, we also need to be aware that there's going to be people that say you need to have a return on investment for these leverage points, which is a test that we never impose on a downstream intervention. You know, so for example, if there's a tragedy in, you know, we go and we spend whatever we need to spend to try to help those people in that tragedy. But when we talk about spending the money to prevent the tragedy in the first place, it becomes, well, is it going to save us money? And so it's a difficult, it's more of a barrier than it is a question to answer, which is what I kind of found in some of these questions, is that they tend to also be barriers and identified that way. Continuing through, you know, how will we get early warning problems, or early warning of the problem? And that's really through getting data and historic trends. You know, and he talks about how data can warn us of a problem that we wouldn't see otherwise, and we can predict issues that would arise. However, at the same time, data can lead us to false positives or warnings of incorrect signals of trouble. You know, so it was interesting to go through this, because every single time you think you've got it down to, oh, we can go upstream, there's throws in that little complexity part into it. How will you know you're succeeding? And this is what is really the most difficult thing in going upstream. And we kind of talked about that at the beginning of the book with the police officers, is success is not always self-evident in the upstream. We can't always see the direct, a direct relationship between what we're doing and what we're preventing. And we end up, you know, approximating what's going on. And sometimes that can lead to ghost victories, is that maybe we aren't really preventing anything. So he talks about, well, how do you prevent from doing things that aren't really helping? So he uses the term pre-gaming, meaning careful consideration of how the measures we're used to measure success might be abused in the first place. You know, are there rising tides? And he talks about in the 90s, when crime rates were going down nationally, police chiefs were all looked at as geniuses. They all had different things they were doing in their different cities, but the whole nation was lowering crime rates. So it wasn't any one thing they were doing. You know, misalignment of a test. Using short-term measures don't always predict success. You know, the lazy bureaucrat test, you know, which I hated this example, but that's what if someone wanted to succeed on these measures with the least effort possible, what would they do? If you're setting out measurements to show what you're going to do to succeed going upstream, if you were the person trying to show success to get that raise or get a bonus or get more funding in your budget, how would you find a way to game the system, essentially? Defiling the mission, you know, are we really meeting the goals outlined with these measurements we've set aside for success, but still failing to solve the long-term mission? And then the unintended consequence test. What should we be paying attention to that's off stage from our work? You know, and so that really leads into his next question, is how will you avoid doing harm? And he talks about an island out in the Pacific off of Australia that would be a conservatory heaven had humans not intervened, going for hunting and trading, you know, bringing in non-native species like rabbits that they used for food, or mice and rats that were accidental stowaways, and cats that that they brought for both companionship and to kill the rodents they brought unintentionally. And because it's an island, none of those species were native to that, and they started killing off the native species there. And there was no natural predators on the island, so they ended up going crazy. So now you have a problem with invasive species. So you try to correct the issue. So they literally introduced viruses to kill the rabbits. But then once the population of rabbits declined, the cats didn't have as much to eat, so they started eating native rare birds. So then they had to hunt down and kill all the cats off the island. But then once the cats were killed off the island, the rabbits rebounded, as did the mice and the rats. And then they had to find a way to kill all them off. And then when they finally thought they solved the problem and got rid of all those invasive species, a non-native invasive weed that the rabbits were keeping at bay took over. So the point of the story is that systems are complex. And when we tinker with a complex system, there's going to be reactions and consequences beyond our immediate scope. So sometimes we need to change our vantage point when looking at systems to really make sure that we're catching everything. He uses another example of New York City Central Park tree pruning budget. And and this, again, I related to directly because we've had some similar experience here, is that there was a plan and they did cut the budget for pruning trees in Central Park. And what happened is branches started to fail and falling. Unfortunately, they weren't just falling on the ground, they were hitting people to the extent that they had a number of large lawsuits, and they ended up paying more money in the lawsuits than they were in the pruning budget in the first place. So, we accompany that local here. Although we plant over 100 trees a year here in the city, we also remove about 60 to 70 trees a year in addition to pruning. And that's really to prevent issues like that, where have public safety. But when you remove any kind of tree, it gets all kinds of criticisms and consequences. And then it makes you want to just say, okay, forget it, we'll leave it. But it's really, you have to be upstream to think about that. And that, he used another example in the book about the Cobra effect, where India used to be the crown jewel of the British Empire. And the British thought that there was a cobra problem. So they incentivized people to bring them dead cobras. But that also provided a disincentive because people then started to farm cobras. And by the time the British Empire realized that this was happening and they were spending way more money than they thought, they cut the program. The farmers just released the cobras and it actually made the problem worse. So again, there's complex systems, and when we try to go upstream, as Dan Heath puts it, you've got to try to have a complete understanding of the system in order to make a change. And then, lastly, and this is kind of the last question is who will pay for what doesn't happen? And this goes back to what I think is really the fourth barrier that Dan doesn't talk about in his book is the resource constraints. And he talks about public health a lot in this section, which really rings true now that we're going through a public health pandemic, where public health agencies are pleading for preventative measures. And he actually quotes the doctor saying, if you do your job, they cut your budget because no one's getting sick. And then another one said, we're willing to pay $40,000 a year for the price of insulin, but we won't pay $1,000 to prevent someone from getting diabetes. So what Dan talks about is that creating payment models to fund upstream efforts can be almost unbelievably complicated and difficult and frustrating. So it's not as easy as just, hey, we can solve this problem, we're moving up. you've got to convince everybody as well. The last two chapters, and one that really resonated is the Chicken Little problem, as Dan put it. And he uses Y2K and as a reference to it. I think that we might all remember the issue with Y2K, and that computers weren't designed to have the right year going from the 1900s to the 2000s, and this was going to cause chaos with all of our computerized systems. And the Clinton administration put together a whole team of people to solve the problem before it happened. And go upstream essentially. And what Dan says is that the Y2Ks was in a no-win situation. If he did his job and nothing happened, people would say, well, what was that all about? What a waste of time and money. On the other hand, if he did everything poorly and power went out and stoplights didn't work, etc., everyone would want to know what the name of that guy was and why didn't he prevent this. So, the question is, as we look back on it, was Y2K, was it a hoax? Was it something that really wasn't a big problem? Or was it prevented by a large-scale effort and a catastrophe avoided? I don't think we'll quite know what the true answer to that is. And that, again, talks about how the great complexity of upstream thinking is and how it's difficult and frustrating to do upstream work. So in closing, I thought this book was very thought-provoking. I thought it did meet the author's goals. And, he uses what I thought was the best example of going upstream, and that's parenting. Nearly everything we do as parents is with an eye toward the future health and happiness of our children. And if we can apply some of that to other areas in our lives, we might see a way to make the world a better place. So that is my quick summary of Upstream. I hope you take a look at it and enjoy the read, and I guess we'll open it up for questions at this point.
So you can, I'm not sure if you see the raise hand feature on your computer, but if you do see it, I can unmute you if you would like to talk verbally, or you can use the chat to type in questions. AJ says it seems like the author advocates spending a lot more time in Covey's quadrant 2. Would you agree?
I'm not remembering that exact example. I think what the author's trying to say is we need to spend a lot more time thinking upstream, figuring out these complex systems, trying to prevent problems, and invest more money in going upstream than we do with the downstream.
AJ says quadrant 2 is important but not urgent.
Yeah, so and that was one of the he talks about that as one of the barriers. Yeah, so that we need to make, and he talks about it specifically like where, oh yes, we all need to write a will, but then all of a sudden it's like, oh, but that's not important right now. It's not urgent. I can do it. It's important, but I can do it later. And that's one of the barriers of that, and that's tunneling. So he does talk about how we need to be cognizant of tunneling and change our perspective, and sometimes make important issues more urgent and to go upstream. So he does talk about that, but in his tunneling section, yes.
And Jenny says that it sounds like this book reflects your own personal philosophy as city manager. Do you always believe this philosophy, or was it something you learned over time?
Well, I think we all kind of agree to this type of philosophy of trying to prevent problems from happening in the first place. But at the same time, and as Dan points out, if we're the child in the river, we want somebody to come save us too. So you can't just ignore the downstream and go and just try to go all upstream. It's a balance, a delicate balance that we all try to achieve, and as a government leader, we try to achieve. And it's not easy. It's always a delicate balance to try to achieve. It's something that I've always tried to, and one of the reasons that I became a public servant in the first place is you want to try to make the world a better place. So solving the problems before they exist. So I think it's just something that I've always had in me, and that this book helped defines it a little bit more.
And then AJ says maybe they missed it, but how do you advise changing one's or a group's perspective so you or they can see the value of working upstream and get to work there?
Well, it's really understanding the problem fully. It's and explaining it, and explaining once you find those leverage points of where you think you can solve a problem, convincing other people that you're right. There is no easy answer, and and that's a difficult thing to do. So I don't think I know all the answers to convincing people to get to where, because sometimes people don't take my recommendations when I'm trying to go upstream, and that's okay. That happens. But I think you've got to try your best to show it in real, meaningful ways. The problem is that sometimes there's just no measurement to prove that upstream is going to work. And we live in a society where everybody wants to save money, especially when you're talking about taxpayer dollars. You've got to be saving money, and how dare you spend my money on that wasteful program, because it doesn't. So it's a very difficult task. You just got to be persistent.
And Marilyn says that I would imagine not all problems have an upstream. Is there a tell as to which problems have an upstream?
Well, that's where the complexity in systems take place, and sometimes they're just accidents and tragedies that are going to happen that we can't prevent. But I think there always is some form of upstream to all of our problems at some point, because there's always a causation. The problem is what's causing it, and how do you find what's causing it? And that's where the book talks about is it's not easy, but if we spend more time thinking about it going upstream, we might find it, and we can solve some problems that we thought were inevitable or regrettably going to happen no matter what. And he does use an example in the book about Hurricane Katrina, and that in the years leading up to that, there was actually a whole team that did a preparedness exercise, and they predicted a hurricane hits New Orleans. And when you compare the preparedness exercise and the things they were considering and how to resolve it compared to the actual Hurricane Katrina, it's almost spot on. The difference in the preparedness exercise is they predicted that 60,000 people would die, and in Katrina it was I think 1,600 or so. So the question is everything they did to prepare, even though a hurricane was inevitable and they can't stop it, did that save 60,000 people? But still have a disaster? That's a question that we don't know. I would like to think that the preparedness exercise and some of the things they did do to prepare did save more lives than could have happened at Katrina. So it's still an inevitable disaster, but still had upstream things to help solve it.
One comment that was made is that certain industries that really work hard at upstream are nuclear energy, aviation, passenger public transit, and that all these industries share a view that low probability but exceptionally catastrophic failure can occur and no expense should be spared to prevent them from happening.
I think that the difficult thing, they say, well, yes, I think we can all agree that no expense should be spared to prevent a catastrophe. The difficulty is that some people will disagree that the catastrophe is coming. And we can see that with the discussion about climate change. We have science, many scientists agree that this is real, it's happening. We need to start doing things. We need to start changing our entire society to make it work. And that's a debate. Obviously, we want to say, yes, there should be no expenditure to save the world, but it's a debate. And it talks about how complex that system really is.
So a continuation from that comment was that the NRC, NTSB, et cetera, to determine failure causes, establish regulations and inspections, et cetera. And they also felt that your comment on climate change is another great example of upstream. Do we have any other comments, or does anyone want me to open it up so that they can verbally say something as opposed to typing it in the chat? I know sometimes using the chat kind of takes a little longer than saying things out loud. And if you wanted to do that, there is a raise hand feature that you can use to let me know. Oh, you're welcome. So we got a nice job, John.
I was just faking it till I made it here, so I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you, Jenny.
And then you did have a compliment earlier in the chat that it was informative. So it doesn't look like we have any other questions or comments for John. So thanks everyone for attending today for Book Sandwich Den, and hopefully you come in to check out Upstream from the library, and you check out other Book Sandwich Den later in the month. Thank you, John, for being here today, and I guess being our first, what did you call yourself, guinea pig for today?
One of the things you said, Alexis, is choose other books that might be similar, that people might be interested in. So if you do read Upstream and you like it, another book that I really love is actually called Stop Decorating the Fish by Kristen Cox. And it's kind of a two-part series, The World of Decorating a Fish. Very similar, but concepts, different way of looking at it. So I'd recommend those as well.
Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, John, and hopefully we'll see you guys again next Monday at noon.
Thank you.